Hello, and welcome to the Speak Your Truth podcast. I am your host, Jaya Rose. I am a speaking, storytelling, and brand growth coach, specifically for transformational leaders, those of you who create change in other people's lives for the better. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about how to be vulnerable with your audience without sabotaging your authority. And what's really fascinating about this is that we could look at being vulnerable and authority in two different lights. Like maybe they're opposite one another and maybe they aren't. And we're going to talk about that today because this was the number one requested topic when I put some options in my Facebook group, Speak Your Truth for Transformational Leaders on Facebook. If you're not over there, come on over because I love to find out what my audience actually wants to hear from me. And this was the number one thing. I thought it was fascinating because no matter how much work we do around vulnerability, I know most of us have at least looked at it and have practiced it in some ways. It's still easy to think that being vulnerable is being weak. Have you thought this before? Have you experienced other people thinking this idea that if you're vulnerable, you're showing weakness because maybe you're showing a softer side of you. Maybe you're showing a side of you that you've never shown anyone before. And ultimately, the real classification of what makes it vulnerable is that in some ways it scares you. In some way, it pushes you to an edge that you have never been to and outside of a comfort zone. And to say that that is different than authority, I think is something we really need to examine. We can understand intellectually that authority is something really important to have with your audience because the key thing we are wanting to develop through our visibility, through speaking, through storytelling, and through community is know, like, and trust, especially when what you are doing is asking people to come in and potentially buy something from you. What that means is that authority needs to be a big piece of this because why is somebody going to trust you? Why is somebody going to come to you and say, oh, you can solve this problem? You see what I desire? You can help me get to the outcome I want? They're going to do that, one, because they believe that you have the answer, which would classify you as an authority. It means that you own it. You know your shit, and people trust that in you. Now, does being vulnerable sabotage that? I mean, I think just looking at this from a standpoint of a question is really valuable. Do you think that being vulnerable would in some way sabotage your authority, the know, the like, the trust, ultimately that holy grail of trust? Would it do that? Um, and here's the thing. Yeah, actually it would. And it could. And I think that's why people wanted to know the answer to this. When you're being vulnerable, you may be sort of like spilling too many beans. And I think this is a common thing that can happen in the online space where we hear, be seen for being you and just show up authentically and be yourself. And that is totally true. But if we keep in mind that know, like, and trust, again, trust being the holy grail, is what we need to have in order for your audience to trust that you can help them, then being vulnerable could mean a lot of different things. Like if the classification we're using is that you're going outside of your comfort zone and being super authentic, there could be a level of that might not actually help you. And we see this in the online space a lot of people, crying on video or having a breakdown. And like that stuff gets a lot of attention. So we need to really look at, well, attention doesn't necessarily mean that someone is going to go to the point of like and trust. They might know who you are. They're like, oh, she's the one who was breaking down on her video. And they're like, oh, that was nice. are they necessarily going to then want to come buy from you, especially if you help them create transformation? If you're a life coach, a business coach, a health coach? Um, no, I mean, I would say not necessarily. And so we want to think about this more as a recipe. It's like a stew, right? It's a stew that we are making and it is evolving. We are adding flavor to it. And one of the flavors we want to add is definitely vulnerability because it makes us freaking relatable. It makes us relatable and it feels good. It feels good to share your truth. The name of my movement is called Speak Your Truth. So I am all about sharing your truth and specifically through storytelling. But I will tell you that one of the number one golden rules that I teach within storytelling is that you need to be healed in order to share a story powerfully. That implies that you are not going to actually be super vulnerable as you share a story that might sort of appear that you're being vulnerable. And that means that you're actually being a leader and you're leading people through a journey. If it's your own story you're sharing, it's the journey of your life, it's the journey of some particular part of your life. And to recognize that we want to be able to be in that emotion because that makes it more powerful. But if you're so in the emotion that you're not able to lead, that's totally valid. Like you get to be in your emotion as much as you want. But to be in leadership, we need to be able to put ourselves to the side in some ways. Would you agree with that? That leadership is asking you to lead from a place where you know that everybody else's desires and wants and really needs are also being considered, which means that we are not only doing what we want. And when we are in a highly emotive state, we a lot of times aren't able to do that. And so people sort of like mix all these things up that being vulnerable means that you're breaking down. Well, that's not true. Being vulnerable means that you're exposing a part of yourself and you're going most likely outside of your comfort zone. But this is where a lot of magic lives. Am I right? Now, the way that we can think about the stew is really helpful because there isn't a right or wrong answer. Like maybe you have a story or you're going to share an experience and you are going to cry and you're going to show real emotion. Listen, I have cried. I can't even tell you how many live videos I've cried on. So many. That does not mean that I sabotaged my authority because I'm in leadership and I know why I'm doing what I'm doing. The intention is what catapults the leadership forward. So if I'm going to come on a live video and tell a story and be vulnerable, that means that I'm letting people in, I'm exposing a part of myself. It may be outside my comfort zone to do that, but the intention is that I'm doing it for them. I'm doing it for my audience. And when your intention is to be of service and your intention is to give, you're never going to be sabotaging anything. Like it's such a righteous endeavor to do that. And your authority ultimately comes from trust. Like that's why somebody is going to refer you to someone else. That's what somebody is going to do. So what somebody is going to do rather when they trust you is look at you like you're an authority. And what does that mean? It means that you're owning it. You are owning it. You are confident. You are in leadership. I can trust that if I say yes to working with you, that you're going to follow through. Now, the only way that being vulnerable would sabotage that in some way is if you demonstrated that you weren't trustworthy. And I think being highly emotive and that can do that. And it's kind of funny because I would never tell someone not to feel their emotions. I want everybody to have the full spectrum of emotion in life. And also, there's just certain things that are relevant to your offer. There are certain things that are relevant to your audience. And as long as we're coming back to that place of leadership and saying, I know why I'm doing this. I'm sharing this story on purpose. I'm showing you this emotion because it's what's real for me in the moment, but it has intention behind it. And it's leading you to something that's really powerful. It's leading you to a possibility. It's leading you to ultimately a new perspective and being able to see something in a new way. Now, doesn't that sound like what we want in our stew, right? In the stew that we're stirring up and saying, this is my visibility. This is how I show up. This is whether I'm on video, whether I'm on stage, it doesn't matter. The recipe is always the same, and it starts with your leadership. So when I talk about vulnerability sabotaging your authority, it's almost like you would have to be pretty unconscious about what you're doing. You would have to do it in a way that you probably know deep down that your audience should not be therapists to you. You know that your audience doesn't want to come onto a video and hold space for your breakdown. Now, they might do that graciously, but is that going to increase trust with you? No. And so it's almost like you'd have to do it on purpose, because I know for me, most of my clients are very empathic, intuitive people. And you can tell, right? When you're empathic and you're intuitive, you can tell if what you're putting out there is making people feel uncomfortable. You're like, well, okay, I just had a complete breakdown. And see, sometimes that might create trust. So this conversation is really nuanced. And it's really to say, let me just serve you your power back on this beautiful platter in this podcast episode right now and say, you know whether what you are putting out there is specifically just only for yourself. And some could say that's being vulnerable. Some could say it's being, self-centered. I don't know. But you also know that when you're real and you are vulnerable and you can share that, people are going to trust you more, because gone are the days. And raise your hand right now, wherever you are in the world, in a seat, in a car, and I don't care where you are, raise your hand if you know that you don't want a guru. That when you're hiring a coach or a guide or somebody to help you get to your next level in some way, you don't want a guru. You don't want somebody that is authoritative, which is important to look at too. We don't want to go so far the opposite way that we're like a robot and we're not relatable. Because for me, one of the core values of my coaching business is human connection. The second core value is empathy and compassion. And that stuff naturally breeds vulnerability. It breeds authenticity. And also, the authority doesn't have to be in this old masculine, I'm better than you, I'm an authority at this. It's really just being a guide. So we could sort of squash this whole conversation if we just say, what does it feel like to be a guide? And maybe you don't have to even look at it as an authority anymore. Although I think we use those words because they're helpful. What if you just looked at it as though you're living your purpose and you're here in service and you want to help the most people you possibly can? And we know that being authentic is going to help that mission. We know that being an authority in the way that you are saying yes to leadership and you are being a guide, that's going to help that mission. So again, what's in your stew? What is in your stew? And can you trust yourself? Can you trust yourself to be deeply in alignment with your truth, that if something pops up, if some big emotion pops up, if you're in the middle of sharing a story and you didn't realize that it might trigger you a little bit, like that is going to be fucking, oh no, sorry, I got no text messages. That is going to be fucking powerful. trusting that, and that you can then, because you set an intention, because you are in leadership, because you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, you move through that emotion and you lead people towards more possibility for themselves. That's what new paradigm leadership looks like. That's what people are craving. Leadership that has connection and empathy inside of it. And that's why I love storytelling so much. So if you've been in a place where you've allowed this question, how can I be vulnerable and also not sabotage my authority? Here's the answer. Just be you and always know the intention behind what you're doing. And that's it. Like, it doesn't have to be complicated. And people want this. I want this. Do you want it? Is what you want more connection and leaders who aren't just showing everything that's shiny, all of the shiny objects only? What about leadership that is coming from more heart? And I think that's what we're all headed towards. So, permission to, yes, be vulnerable, and also, yes, be an expert or an authority or a guide, whatever words resonate with you most. Yes, and like, you're fucking amazing. You can be it all. Go for it. And I think that's really the answer, is that you would almost have to go out of your way to sabotage. And if that is where you're at, like, check yourself. You got to ask yourself, would I trust me? Do I trust me deeply? And if you do, then you're never going to step out of bounds. And I love that saying. It's in sales, and I'm probably not going to say it perfectly, but it's like, you can never say the wrong thing to the right people. And you can never say the right thing to the wrong people. And I love that, because it's so true. It's like, you're not going to be for everybody. Your message isn't going to land with everybody, but it couldn't not land with the right people. They will be magnetized towards you. The energy speaks louder than anything else, speaks louder than the words we're saying. And we can trust ourselves that we can show up powerfully in vulnerability, in stories, and really share our true selves and still be seen as the guide. Boom. Okay. That is it. That is what I have to share today. And I'm so grateful that you tuned in for this episode of the Speak Your Truth podcast. If you don't already follow me on all the social medias, I recently joined TikTok and I am loving it over there. So come over there. I am Coach Jaya Rose. And then, of course, Instagram is an awesome way to connect with me. I am the Jaya Rose. You can send me a message if you want to share with me any aha moments that you might have had in this episode. And I will always be breaking down the week's episode over in my Speak Your Truth community for transformational leaders on Facebook. So come over to all the places. I'll link everything below. And just know that your message, your story, and your truth is medicine for the people who need you most. So get out there, share it powerfully, and show up. We'll see you next time.